On the first Saturday of October, 7 pickup trucks parked nose to tail along a gravel road in Callaway County, Kentucky, and the men who climbed out of them had all, at some point that summer, laughed at the same little girl. They were not laughing now. They had come because of something a seed dealer had said at the co-op 2 days earlier, something none of them believed, and they walked up to the fence line of the Pruitt farm and stopped talking all at once. Every field they had passed on the drive out looked the same, pale, tired, the washed-out yellow-green of a county grinding through its third straight year of drought. Every field except this one. The soybeans on the upper slope of Harlan Pruitt's place stood dense and dark, the canopy so thick you could not see soil between the rows, every leaf tilted up toward the sun like the plants had something to prove. Before we go on, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story. And now, let's continue. One of the men ducked through the fence without asking permission. He walked 10 rows deep, pulled a pod off a stem, and split it open with his thumbnail. He stared at what was inside for a long moment. Fat, heavy, perfectly filled seeds, in a year when half the county was wondering whether harvesting would even pay for the diesel. Then he turned around and looked at the person responsible. A skinny 11-year-old girl standing at the edge of the field with dirt on her boots and a pipe wrench sticking out of her back pocket. "What did you do different?" he asked. And here is the strange part. 4 months earlier, that same man had leaned against his own porch rail and chuckled while that same girl loaded his garbage into a homemade wooden trailer. She had knocked on his door, asked politely for his trash, and he had given it to her the way you give a child anything harmless. Then he had watched her pedal away with it and shaken his head. Nearly every farmer on that road had done the same thing that summer, handed her their junk, watched her haul it off, laughed the gentle, confused laugh of grown men who cannot imagine what a child could possibly want with broken pipes. None of them knew that the junk they were laughing about was going to outgrow every acre they owned. None of them knew that this girl had noticed something about water that men with 40 years of experience had stopped seeing a long time ago. And not one of them could have guessed that before the leaves turned, they would be standing in her father's field, hats in their hands, asking an 11-year-old to teach them how she did it. She never told anyone what she was building. Not the farmers, not her brother, not even her father. She worked alone. She failed again, and she kept her mouth shut the entire time. To understand how a child pulled that off, you have to go back to the last Saturday in May, back to a dirt road at 7 in the morning, and a girl on a bicycle with a secret she had no intention of sharing. Callaway County sits in the far western corner of Kentucky, where the land rolls in long, gentle swells down toward the Tennessee River. It is old farm country, quiet roads, white church steeples, tobacco barns going silver with age. The kind of place where families have worked the same dirt for 4 generations and are not the least bit embarrassed to say so. By the middle of every summer, the sky takes on the color of old brass, and the air carries the smell of turned earth, diesel exhaust, and hay drying in the sun. But for 3 years running, something had been wrong with the summers. The rain that used to come in steady, dependable waves now arrived in stingy little bursts, weeks apart, and the ground drank each one like a man who knows the well is going dry. Ponds shrank inside their own banks. Creeks that had names on the county map turned to strings of warm puddles. Farmers who had never in their lives prayed out loud started doing it in their trucks with the windows up. The Pruitt farm was about 40 acres of river bottom and slope on the eastern side of the county. Harlan Pruitt grew corn and soybeans there, and occasionally tobacco in the years when the price made it worth the aggravation. He was a deliberate man, slow to speak, slow to anger, patient with machinery, patient with weather, patient with his children. The only thing on earth that truly tested him was drought, and drought had been testing him for 3 years without letting up. His wife, June, kept a kitchen garden of almost ridiculous ambition. Tomatoes staked 6 feet high, peppers, squash, pole beans climbing strings on hand-cut cedar poles. She was the one who had first pressed seeds into the hands of their middle child, back when the girl was barely old enough to reach the soil without bending her knees. That middle child was Della. 11 years old the summer this story happened. Quiet, in the particular way that gets mistaken for shyness, but is actually just concentration. She had an older brother, Cass, who was 14 and mostly interested in engines and in being 14. She had a little sister, Wren, who was 8 and followed Della around the farm the way a shadow follows a fence post. And then there was Opal. Opal was Harlan's mother, 81 years old, and she lived in a small room off the back of the farmhouse with a window that faced the fields. Most mornings, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a stack of old agricultural extension pamphlets she had been collecting since the 1960s. Yellowed paper, stapled corners, government printing, soil conservation, irrigation methods, farm pond construction. She read them the way other people read novels, and she had read most of them a dozen times. The family teased her about it gently. Cass once asked her why she kept a pamphlet about irrigation from 1968 when nobody irrigated that way anymore. Opal looked at him over her glasses and said, "Water hasn't changed since 1968. Only the people have." Nobody paid much attention to that answer, except one person at the table who was 10 years old at the time and who quietly decided that her grandmother might be the smartest person she knew. It was Opal who noticed it first. She noticed it because she spent her days at a window and because old women who sit at windows see things that busy people miss. She noticed that when Della walked the farm, the girl was not looking at what everyone else looked at. Cass looked at the equipment. Harlan looked at the crops. June looked at the sky. Della looked at the water, where it pooled after a rain, where it ran off and where it sank in. Which patch of ground cracked first in dry weather, and which patch stayed dark 2 days longer than the rest. The girl would stop in the middle of a chore and stare at a wet spot in a ditch the way other children stare at television. Opal watched her do it for the better part of a year and said nothing to anyone. She just started leaving certain pamphlets out on the kitchen table, face up, and noticing which ones disappeared. By the spring this story begins, the drought had its hands around the throat of the whole county, and the Pruitt farm was hurting in one place worse than all the others: the upper fields. The upper fields sat on the high ground at the back of the property, where the soil ran sandier than the river bottom below. Sandy soil is honest soil in a wet year. It drains well, it warms early, it is easy to work. But in a drought, sandy soil is a thief. Water passes through it so fast that the roots barely get a taste, and by the third dry summer, Harlan's soybeans up there were suffering almost from the day they broke ground. Pale leaves, slow growth, plants curling in on themselves by 2 in the afternoon, trying to hide from their own sky. Harlan did what a careful man does. He called the county extension office. The extension agent for that part of Callaway County was a steady, sunburned man named Clifton Barr, who had spent 20 years answering farmers' questions and had grown a thick skin about how rarely his answers fixed anything. He drove out to the Pruitt place twice that May. He walked the upper fields, crumbled the dry soil between his fingers, and gave Harlan the only advice the situation allowed: irrigate more often, mulch around the plants to slow the evaporation, hope for rain. It was good advice, and it was almost useless, and both men knew it. Irrigating more often meant burning more diesel to run the pump, and diesel cost money that a third drought year had already eaten. Worse than the cost was the physics. The pump pulled from the pond at the bottom of the property and pushed water uphill through long aluminum lines, and by the time that water climbed the slope to the high ground, the pressure had bled away to almost nothing. The far ends of the rows got a dribble. The sprinklers threw a fine mist into hot afternoon air, and a good share of that mist never touched a leaf. It just vanished, straight up, back into the brass-colored sky. Harlan and Clifton stood at the tailgate of the truck talking it through, the way men do, in half sentences and long pauses. Neither of them noticed the girl sitting on the fence rail 10 feet away, listening to every single word. When Clifton finished, Della spoke up for the first time. "If the pressure drops going uphill," she asked, "what happens to the water that never makes it to the top?" Clifton turned and looked at her. It was not the kind of question he was used to hearing from 11-year-olds. It was not, honestly, the kind of question he was used to hearing from anyone. "It just stops," he said. "Sits in the line, runs back down when you shut the pump off." Della nodded. But it was not the nod of a child receiving new information. It was the slow, careful nod of a person who has been turning something over in her mind for a long time and has just been handed the last piece. Clifton would remember that nod months later, and he would tell people about it, and every time he told it, he would shake his head at himself for not asking her what she was thinking. Because what she was thinking was this: everyone on the farm treated water like a thing you had to push it uphill with a pump, push it through pipes with pressure, push it against its nature, and pay for every foot of the fight in diesel and money and loss. But Della had spent a year watching water when nobody pushed it at all, and water that nobody pushes does one thing everywhere, always, for free. It falls. That was the end of May. She did not say another word about it to anyone, and on the first Saturday of June, the farmers of Callaway County began to see something on their roads that they would talk about at the co-op for the rest of their lives, without having the faintest idea what they were looking at. A girl on a bicycle pulling a wooden trailer hunting for garbage. The trailer was Della's own. Her father had built it 2 winters back so she could haul feed for the laying hens she kept, a little flock that was entirely her operation. She sold the eggs to neighbors and to the diner in town, and she kept her money in a coffee can in her closet, and nobody in the family had ever counted how much was in it. That trailer, hitched behind her bicycle, became her freight line. Every Saturday morning she was on the road by 7 before the heat came down. She knew where she was going because she had spent the last week of May doing something no one noticed: riding the county roads slowly, looking at the edges of fields. Farms shed their history at the edges. That is where the old equipment goes to die. Rusted planters swallowed by honeysuckle, wagon frames with trees growing up through them, and lying in the tall grass along fence rows, mile after mile of the thing Della wanted. Old irrigation pipe. Aluminum lateral lines from systems that had been replaced or abandoned. Sections of it everywhere, some bent, some sound, most of it lying exactly where it had been dragged years ago, worth too little to sell and too much trouble to haul off. To every farmer in the county, it was scenery. It had been scenery for so long that they no longer saw it at all. Della saw it, and one Saturday at a time, she started knocking on doors. She was polite in a way that adults found disarming. She would knock, step back off the porch, and when the door opened, she would say her name, say whose daughter she was, and ask whether she might have some of the old pipe lying along the north fence, or behind the barn, or down by the creek crossing. She never once said what it was for. And farmer after farmer gave her the same answer: "Sure, honey, help yourself." Then they would lean against their porch rails with their coffee and watch this small, serious girl wrestle 10-foot sections of aluminum pipe into a wooden trailer, strap them down with baling twine, and pedal off down the road with the load rattling behind her. And they would chuckle, not meanly. Most of them liked her. It was the soft, helpless laughter of complete bafflement, the kind that comes out of a man who is watching something he cannot begin to explain. Word traveled, because in a county like that, word always travels. At the co-op, at the feed store, in the pews on Sunday, men told each other about the Pruitt girl and her pipe collection. Theories were offered. She was building a fort. She was going to sell it for scrap, though anyone who checked the price of scrap aluminum laughed harder at that one. One old boy swore she was building a still, and even the preacher smiled at that. Her own family was not much better informed. Cass, 14 and certain of everything, told her flat out that she was wasting the only summer she was ever going to get as an 11-year-old, hauling trash for no reason she would even say out loud. He said it more than once. He said it in front of his friends. Della let him say it and went on loading pipe. Wren, on the other hand, decided the whole business was wonderful. She could not lift a full section of pipe, so she appointed herself the keeper of small things. Fittings, clamps, bits of hardware Della pried off the junk systems. Wren carried them in a 5-gallon bucket and guarded them like treasure. And she asked question after question, and Della answered exactly none of them. That did not discourage Wren in the slightest. She started a notebook. On the cover she wrote, in careful 8-year-old letters, "Della's Secret Project. Evidence." June watched her daughter come home sunburned and filthy every Saturday and made her wash before supper and did not press. Harlan said nothing at all. But more than once that June, Della came out in the morning to find her trailer's hitch quietly repaired or a fresh strip of rubber padding the rail where the pipes rode, and nobody in the house ever admitted to touching it. And Opal sat at her window, drank her black coffee, and watched the stack of aluminum growing behind the equipment shed week by week. She noticed something else, too. 2 of her pamphlets had gone missing from the kitchen table. One was about a method of watering crops through small holes in a line, drop by drop, straight to the roots. The other was about moving water without pumps, the old way, the way it was done before electricity ever reached farm country. Opal read her stack every morning, so she knew exactly which 2 were gone. She poured herself another cup and kept the knowledge to herself. Some things, she figured, a person is entitled to build in peace. By the middle of July, the stack behind the shed had grown into something the neighbors would have gaped at if any of them had ever come around back to see it. Sorted by length, sorted by width, bent sections in one pile, straight in another, fittings in coffee cans that Wren labeled with masking tape. A child's scrapyard, arranged with the care of a surgeon's tray. Della had gathered more irrigation pipe than some working farms in the county owned, and she still had not told a single living soul what it was for. But a plan that big cannot stay invisible forever, because a plan that big has a weakness, and Della had known about the weakness from the very beginning. All the pipe in Kentucky is worthless without one thing: water. Water in the right place, and the right place, on the Pruitt farm, was the one place everybody knew there wasn't any. To understand what Della was up against, you have to see the farm the way she saw it, lying in bed at night with 2 stolen pamphlets under her mattress. The first pamphlet described something called drip irrigation. Instead of throwing water into the air with sprinklers and hoping some of it lands where it matters, a drip system moves water through narrow lines laid along the crop rows and lets it out through tiny openings called emitters, slowly, drop by drop, right at the base of each plant. Nothing sprays into the hot air to vanish. Nothing runs down the slope to be wasted. The pamphlet said a well-built drip line could grow the same crop on barely half the water of an overhead system, sometimes less, because every drop went where roots could actually drink it. In a county dying of thirst, that single page read like scripture. The second pamphlet was older, and it described the way people moved water before pumps existed. Gravity. If your water sits higher than your field, you do not need a pump, or diesel, or pressure you have to buy. You need pipe and patience and arithmetic. Water at a higher elevation, released into a closed line, will push itself downhill and come out the far end with real force, and the force is free, and it never breaks down, and it never sends you a bill. The old-timers called the measure of that force head. Every foot of height the water falls is a foot of head, and a foot of head is pressure you did not have to pay for. Della put the 2 pamphlets together the way you strike 2 flints together. A drip system barely needs any pressure at all. That is the whole beauty of it. It does not have to throw water 50 feet through the air. It only has to coax water gently through small openings a few inches from the ground. A conventional sprinkler line demands the kind of pressure only a pump can give. But a drip line, a slow, patient, humble drip line, could run on the pressure of water falling just a handful of feet. Which meant the question of her whole summer came down to one thing: was there any water on the Pruitt farm that sat higher than the dying fields? And the answer, the obvious answer, the answer that had stopped everyone else from ever thinking this far, was no. The pond, the good pond, the spring-fed pond that had never gone dry in living memory, not even in the worst summers anyone could name, sat at the bottom of the property. The suffering fields sat on the high ground, a solid 14 feet above it. All that beautiful, dependable water, and every drop of it on the wrong side of gravity. To use the pond, you had to pump, and pumping was the very thing that was failing. Della stood at the edge of that pond one evening in June and felt the whole idea die in her chest. She had a trailer full of pipe, a plan straight out of 1968, and water that lived in the one place her plan could not reach. Another child would have quit that evening. What Della did instead tells you everything about her. She stopped looking at the water she wanted and went looking for water nobody wanted. She found it on the north edge of the property, in a place so ordinary that it did not even have a name. The family just called it the Draw, a shallow, grassy crease in the hillside where the ground folded in on itself, up beyond the last fence line. Nothing grew there worth harvesting. No one plowed it. Its single claim to attention was that it was a nuisance. After a storm, water gathered in the low spot of that draw and stood for days. It stood so long that Harlan had once talked about ditching it just to dry it out, and never got around to it. Standing water in a fold of grass. To every adult on the farm, a minor annoyance. To the men at the co-op, if they had ever seen it, nothing at all. Della stood at the edge of the draw with her boots sinking slightly into ground that was damp in the driest June in 3 years, and asked herself the question no one had asked. Why is this spot wet when the whole county is dry? She got her answer, as she got so many answers that summer, from her grandmother's paper library. Deep in Opal's stack was a survey pamphlet from the 1960s, from back when the Extension Service mapped farm water sources across the county, and in its faded pages, the north end of the Pruitt property was marked with a small notation: a wet weather seep, a place where groundwater, moving slowly through the hillside, leaks out at the surface. Not a spring you could name or fence, nothing dramatic, just a patient underground trickle that surfaces in the fold of the draw. In wet years, it drowned in rainwater and no one noticed it. In dry years, it shrank to a whisper, a slow, dark dampness in the grass, a cupful at a time. But it never fully stopped. The survey crew had noted it 60 years ago, and 60 years later, it was still doing the same quiet work. That was why the draw held storm water for days when other low spots dried in hours. The ground under it was already wet from below. A cupful at a time sounds like nothing, but Della had done something almost no adult bothers to do. She had done the arithmetic of drip. A slow trickle running all day and all night, 7 days a week, adds up to a startling amount of water if you have somewhere to keep it. And a drip system sips. It does not gulp the way sprinklers gulp. A seep that could never in 100 years supply a spray gun could absolutely fill a basin overnight. And a basin of stored water, released gently through drip lines during the day, could keep a 1/4 acre of soybeans alive. The seep could not water a field, but the seep could fill a bucket, and the bucket could water the field, if the bucket was big enough and the field drank slowly enough. One question remained, and it was the question everything hung on. Was the draw actually higher than the suffering fields? It looked higher, but hillsides lie to the eye, and Della was not about to spend a summer of hauling on a guess. So she built a level. It is an old trick, older than the pamphlets, older than the county. She took a long length of clear plastic tubing from the farm shop, filled it with water, and had Wren hold one end at the edge of the draw while she walked the other end down the slope toward the field. Water in a tube always settles to the same height at both ends. It cannot help itself. It is the most honest surveyor on earth. Reading off a marked stick, moving in stages, writing figures in Wren's evidence notebook, the two girls spent a whole hot afternoon measuring the hillside 4 inches at a time. Wren still did not know what any of it was for. She helped anyway, because Della had asked her to, and being asked was enough. By supper time, Della had her number. The bottom of the draw sat 9 feet above the upper field. 9 feet. That was the whole treasure. Not a river, not a well, not a pump. 9 feet of falling. Enough head, said the old pamphlets tables, to push water through a properly built line and out through drip emitters across a 1/4 acre of ground, forever, silently, for free. 14 feet of elevation stood between the pond and the fields, and it made all that good water useless. 9 feet stood between the draw and the fields, and it was about to make a puddle of nuisance water the most valuable thing on the farm. Same gravity, same county. The only difference was which direction it pointed, and an 11-year-old was the only person in Callaway County who had thought to check. The work she did next was the least glamorous of the whole summer, and it mattered as much as any of it. Before a single pipe could be laid, the draw had to become a reservoir. Della spent the last 2 weeks of June deepening the low spot with a hand shovel, an hour or two at a time in the cool of the morning, cutting the basin down and squaring its sides, piling the spoil into a low bank on the downhill lip. The soil in the bottom of the draw ran to clay, which was the first luck she had gotten all summer, because clay holds water the way sand never will. She puddled and packed the clay along the bottom and sides the way one of the pamphlets described for farm ponds, treading it, smearing it, sealing the basin like the inside of a clay bowl. At the deep end, she set a short standpipe with a screen over its mouth, scavenged hardware, so the outflow would draw clean water instead of leaves and mud. It was on the second Saturday of that digging that Harlan Pruitt did the thing his daughter never forgot. He had walked up to the north fence that morning for reasons of his own, and he stopped, and he stood at a distance, and he watched his 11-year-old cutting a basin into the hillside with a shovel taller than she was. He watched for a long time. He looked at the basin and the standpipe and the stack of sorted aluminum gleaming behind the equipment shed a quarter-mile below, and whatever he understood or did not understand in that moment, he kept off his face entirely. Then he walked back to the barn, took down a second shovel, carried it up the hill, and started digging beside her. He did not ask what they were building. She did not tell him. They worked until noon in a silence that was not empty at all. And when June rang the dinner bell, Harlan shouldered both shovels and said the only sentence he would say about the project for the next month. "Ground's easier after a rain, if we ever see one." That was Harlan's way. Some fathers ask questions. Some fathers just show up with a shovel. The basin filled slower than hope and faster than doubt. The seep did its patient work night after night, and one small July storm did the rest. And within a week of finishing the clay, Della stood on the bank looking at several thousand gallons of stored water sitting 9 feet above her father's dying soybeans. Nuisance water. Garbage water, water no one had wanted, held in a bowl no one had believed in, waiting on pipes no one had thought were worth picking up out of the grass. Now came the part she had been imagining since May, and now came the part where everything failed. It is worth being honest about what Della built that July, because the story is better for the truth. What she built was not elegant. It was a child's translation of an engineer's idea, drawn in the dirt with a stick and assembled out of whatever the county had thrown away. The main line ran from the standpipe in the basin, down the slope, through a gate valve she had bought new because some things you do not trust to salvage. From the main line, smaller lines branched off along the tops of the crop rows, and along those rows ran the one component she had paid real money for: drip tape. Thin-walled tubing with emitters built in at regular spacing, bought at the farm supply store in town with egg money counted out of the coffee can. The whole can, every crumpled bill of a year's worth of Saturdays. The man at the counter asked if her daddy was putting in drip. She said the tape was for a project and thanked him and left, and he told that story for years afterward too. She connected the salvaged aluminum with whatever the fittings allowed, stepping between pipe sizes with adapters, sealing joints as best she knew how. She trenched the main line in shallow by hand so the sun could not cook it and a tractor tire could not crush it. It took her the better part of 2 weeks. On a still, white-hot morning in the middle of July, with only Wren for a witness, Della walked up the hill to the basin, put her hand on the new valve, and opened her system for the first time. Water moved. She could hear it, a hollow, rushing whisper running away down the buried line, the sound of a summer of work coming alive. She ran down the slope after it, heart pounding. The system leaked in 3 places before the water got 30 yards. Not seeps, failures. One joint wept steadily into the trench. One sprayed a fine hissing fan into the air, the exact waste the whole design existed to prevent. And one connection near the basin let go entirely and shoved itself apart, and her precious stored water, the water the hillside had spent 2 weeks saving drop by drop, gushed out into the grass and ran away downhill, doing no good to anyone, exactly as it had done for 100 years. Della closed the valve. Wren, wisely, said nothing. They stood together looking at the wet grass, and then Della did the thing that separates the people who build things from the people who merely start them. She got a notebook of her own, walked the whole line, and wrote down every joint that had failed and why. Wrong-sized coupling forced to fit, threads seated crooked, old aluminum flared out of round and mated to a fitting that could never truly grip it. She rode to town and spent more egg money, this time on rolls of thread sealing tape and a bag of proper clamps, and she spent 4 days taking apart and remaking every single connection in the system, not just the 3 that had failed. The ones that had held, she rebuilt anyway. If 3 joints had lied to her, she was no longer taking any joint's word for it. The second attempt did not gush. The second attempt did something quieter and, in its own way, more discouraging. It trickled. Water reached the first row of soybeans. It even dripped from the first emitters, slow, dark spots blooming in the dust at the base of the first plants. And, for about a minute, Della allowed herself to feel it working. Then she walked the rows. The second line ran weaker than the first. The third barely wept. The far rows got nothing at all. The pressure that 9 feet of fall should have given her was vanishing somewhere inside her own pipes, and the system delivered a thin, irregular drink to a lucky few plants and left the rest to the drought. Some plants got water. Most did not. A system like that is not a small success. It is just a slow failure. Cass found her sitting on the bank of the basin that evening, and whatever 14-year-old remark he had carried up the hill with him, he looked at his sister's face and swallowed it. He sat down next to her instead. After a while, he said, "Engine won't idle right. You don't sell the truck. You find the clog." It was the closest thing to encouragement he knew how to build, and it was, as it happened, exactly the right diagnosis. Somewhere in her system, the water was fighting itself. Della went back to the source of everything, Opal Stack. She found her answer in a pamphlet on farm water systems, in a dry little section she had skimmed past twice before because it looked like nothing but tables. Pipe diameter. The width of a pipe, the pamphlet explained, does not just decide how much water can move through it. It decides how much of your precious pressure gets eaten alive by friction along the way. Force water through a line that is too narrow, and the pipe itself becomes your enemy. Every foot of it drags at the flow, and pressure that gravity gave you for free is spent rubbing against your own walls, and by the far end, there is nothing left. Her main line, the long run carrying the whole system's supply, was built from the narrowest pipe she had collected, because narrow pipe had been the easiest for a girl to lift into a trailer. She had, without knowing it, built a highway 1 lane wide. The fix was simple to say and brutal to do. The main line had to come out, all of it, and be rebuilt from wide-diameter pipe, with the narrow stuff demoted to the short branch lines where it belonged. Simple, except Della had almost no wide pipe and almost no egg money, and July was burning away. Which is how she came to knock on one more door, the door of Wendell Coe. Wendell was a retired farmer on the far side of the district who had run a commercial vegetable operation until he closed it down in 2009. And everyone knew his barn was still stacked to the rafters with the irrigation equipment of a serious business. Wide aluminum mains, manifolds, fittings in wooden bins, sorted and oiled. He was known to be sharp in a trade and not sentimental about strangers. Della stood on his porch, 11 years old, and offered him a deal with a straight face. Her narrow pipe, good clean sections, more of them than he would believe, in trade for a smaller number of his wide ones. Wendell heard her out. Then he asked what she was building. It was the question every adult in the county had been asking behind her back for 2 months, put to her directly for the first time by a man holding something she needed. Della looked at him and told him the truth. Something that should work, it doesn't yet. The main line's too narrow. Wendell Coe looked at this child for a long moment. Then he laughed, one short, dry syllable, and said, "Too narrow. Well, you're closer than most of the men I've farmed with." He opened the barn. They spent 2 weeks that late July making trips, her trailer and his old flatbed, trading and hauling and arguing cheerfully about fittings. And when she once tried to sweeten the trade because it plainly ran in her favor, he waved her off and told her he was charging her plenty. He was collecting stubbornness, he said, and hers was the best he'd seen in years. The third version of the system went together in the first days of August. Wide main from the standpipe down the slope, stepping down to the narrow branches, stepping down again to the drip tape along the rows. Pressure spent exactly where the pamphlet's tables said to spend it. Della walked the whole line twice before she touched the valve. Then, on an August morning with the sky already going white at 8 o'clock, she opened it. No gush, no leak, no spray. For a moment, nothing at all, just the low hush of water traveling underground, and a girl standing on a hillside holding her breath. Then, along the first row, dark spots. Along the second row, dark spots. The third, the fifth, the ninth, all the way to the far corner of the quarter-acre. At the very last emitter on the very last line, a slow, steady, unhurried bead of water swelling and dropping into the dust, and another behind it, and another, patient as a heartbeat. The whole field was drinking, every row, every plant, and on the entire hillside nothing made a sound. No pump hammering, no diesel smoke, no spray hissing away into the hot air. Just gravity doing what it had always been willing to do for anyone who arranged the pipes and asked. Wren whooped and went cartwheeling down a row. Della stood at the valve a while longer, listening to nothing, which was the sound of everything working. Then she went to fetch her notebook, because there were emitters to check and flow to balance, and a system is not finished the day it starts. It is only born. What happened over the next 4 weeks happened the way the best things on a farm always happen, slowly, and then all at once. Day by day, the emitters did their quiet work. Every morning before the heat, Della walked her quarter-acre, and every morning the soil at the base of the plants was dark and cool, while the ground between the rows stayed dust. That is the strange, thrifty signature of a drip system. It does not water a field, it waters plants. The weeds in the dry middles starved while the soybeans drank, which was one more gift she had not even planned on. She learned to read the system like weather. Which emitter ran slow and wanted flushing, how far the basin dropped on a scorching day, and how much the seep gave back overnight. She kept her figures in the notebook, in columns, the way the pamphlets kept theirs. And the plants answered. Not overnight. Plants do not work overnight. But week by week, through that burning August, the soybeans on the watered quarter-acre stopped flinching from the afternoons. The curled leaves relaxed and spread flat. The pale green deepened, shade by shade, into the glossy, saturated color of a crop with nothing to fear. New growth stacked on new growth. By the last days of August, the plants stood tall and wide-shouldered, rows closing over the middles, while 10 feet away, across an invisible line where the drip tape ended, the same variety of soybean planted on the same day in the same soil stood thin, yellowed, and quietly giving up. You could see the line from the county road if you knew to look. For a while, nobody knew to look. Harlan found it on the last Saturday of August, and he found it honestly, walking his own fields the way he did every week of his life. He came up over the rise of the upper ground expecting the sight that had greeted him all summer, a field he was already grieving. What he saw instead stopped him where he stood. He walked the green rows once, slowly, saying nothing. He crouched and pressed his fingers into soil that was moist 3 inches down in the driest county in Kentucky. He looked at leaves the color of a good year. He looked at pods setting on heavy and full. Then he walked the rows a second time, because a careful man checks. And then Harlan Pruitt went looking for his daughter. He found her at the top of the run, flat on her stomach in the dirt, reaching under the canopy to adjust an emitter, with her notebook open beside her. He stood over her for a moment, looking at the whole of it. The buried line coming down off the hillside, the valve, the girl. "How much water is this using?" he finally asked. Della sat up, brushed her hands, and told him. She had the figures ready because, of course, she did. Measured against what his pump and sprinklers burned to cover the same ground, her system was delivering the crop on about 40% of the water, and not one drop of it cost a dime of diesel. Harlan looked at the number the way farmers look at numbers that change things. He was quiet for a long time. His whole life he had fought that slope, and paid to fight it, and here it was watering itself off a puddle he had once planned to drain. Whatever he felt about the summer of silence, about the trailer and the pipes and the shovel he had carried up the hill on faith, he folded it into a single question, which was, when you knew the man, the highest praise he had ever given anyone. "You want to extend it to the east field?" Della said yes. And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough, and they walked down to supper together. And at the table that night, Harlan said to the family, "Della's got the upper quarter fixed," in the exact tone he would have used to report that the truck was running again. Opal, at her end of the table, sipped her coffee and asked no questions at all, which told Della everything about how much her grandmother had known all along. In September, Clifton Barr came back, officially this time with a clipboard. He had heard something at the co-op, the way everyone eventually heard everything, and he drove out expecting to find a nice little garden project he could be encouraging about. Instead, he spent 2 hours walking a working, gravity-fed drip network built from salvage by a 6th grader, and the longer he walked it, the quieter he got. He checked the head with his own instruments and got 9 feet. He asked about the seep, and Della showed him the survey pamphlet from the 1960s, and he held that yellowed paper like it was a museum piece. He asked her why the main line was wide and the branches narrow, and she told him about friction, in her own words, correctly, and Clifton Barr stopped writing for a second and just looked at her. He had the posture, people said afterward, of a man recalibrating something, not the system, his assumptions. He told Harlan, out by the trucks, that in 20 years of extension work, he had never seen a gravity drip network built from discard perform like that on a family farm, and that the figures deserved to be written up properly. He asked permission to bring an agricultural engineering student out from Murray State in the spring to map and measure the whole installation. He also, being an honest man, told Della the one thing she needed to hear from somebody official: that the idea was old. Older than her, older than him, old as farming in dry places, and that this took nothing away from her because the idea had been lying around this county as long as the pipes had, in plain sight of everyone, and she was the only one who had bent down and picked either one up. The county paper came after that. A reporter spent an afternoon on the farm and wrote a feature that ran on the front page, below the fold, with a photograph of Della standing at her valve looking like she would rather be anywhere else. The headline called her a young innovator. Della read it once and privately concluded that the word was embarrassing and went back to planning the east field. But papers do what papers do. Word, which had been trickling all summer, now moved through Callaway County like water through a wide main. And so we come back around to where this story began, to the first Saturday of October, and 7 pickup trucks parked along a gravel road, and the men climbing out of them. They were the same men. That is the part worth sitting with. The man who had watched her load his pipe from his porch rail with a coffee cup in his hand. The man whose fence row she had cleaned of 30 years of aluminum. The one who had told the still joke at the co-op, and the ones who had laughed at it. They had all heard the seed dealer and read the paper, and they had driven out that morning expecting, in all honesty, to be polite, to see a clever child's project, say something kind, and go home. They were not prepared for what they found. The upper field was a different color than every field in the county. It was not slightly better. It was not respectable under the circumstances. It was a field from a different year, a wet year, a remembered year, standing dense and dark and heavy with pods in the middle of the 3rd worst drought anyone present could name. Neighboring that green, across the line where the tape ended, stood the drought's own version of the same crop, thin and pale, so that the 2 summers, the one everyone had suffered and the one Della had built, grew side by side with a single step between them. A few of the men walked the rows without saying a word. One pulled a pod and split it open with his thumbnail and looked at it a long moment and turned and asked his question of the girl at the field's edge. "What did you do different?" And now, at last, after a whole summer of silence, Della told them everything. She walked 7 grown farmers up her hillside and showed them a puddle. She showed them the draw they had all driven past their whole lives, deepened and clay-lined into a basin, and the screened standpipe, and the 60-year-old pamphlet that had told her the hillside leaked. She showed them the level she and Wren had made from clear tubing, and the figure 9 written in an 8-year-old's handwriting. And she explained what 9 feet of falling water is worth if you spend it slowly enough. She walked them down the main line and explained why it was wide and where it stepped down and why. She knelt and held back the canopy so they could watch an emitter release one unhurried bead of water into dark soil, and she told them what the whole quarter-acre drank in a day, and she watched 7 men do that arithmetic against their own diesel bills in real time. She showed them the fittings, the clamps, the mended joints from the first failure, because she showed them the failures too, all of them, the blown coupling and the trickling second attempt and the narrow main line that had eaten her pressure, because the failures were half the map. And every piece of it, every yard of aluminum gleaming faintly under the grass, was material those same men had handed her off their own fence rows, garbage they had laughed her down the road with 4 months and 1 long summer ago. Nobody laughed now. The laughter was gone, and in its place had arrived something quieter that takes far longer to earn and lasts far longer once it comes. The men asked questions, real ones, the kind they asked each other. They argued gently about whether this draw or that pond on their own places sat high enough. One of them, the one with the pod still in his hand, asked the question the rest were circling. Would she help them lay out something like it before spring planting? Della said she would. She said it plainly, no ceremony, the same voice she had used on their porches in June asking for their trash. And the men nodded and shook Harlan's hand and shook hers, which several of them had never once in their lives done with a child, and drove home through a yellow county thinking hard about their own low, wet, worthless places. That evening, after the trucks were gone, Della did one more thing. She picked a pod from the best row, the heaviest she could find, and carried it into the house, into the small room off the back where the window faces the fields. She put it on the table next to the black coffee, on top of a pamphlet from 1968. Opal picked it up and split it with her thumbnail and looked at the seeds for a while, and then she looked at her granddaughter over her glasses. "Water hasn't changed," she said. "Only the people," Della said. The old woman smiled, and that was the entire conversation, and it was the best one either of them had all year. There is a thought attributed to an old Japanese farmer and philosopher that the true harvest of farming was never really the crop, that what a farm actually grows, if it is working right, is the person tending it. By any measure that matters, that upper quarter acre had a remarkable yield. Water-thrifty, soil-dark, drought-proof soybeans that outperformed fields run by men with decades of experience, grown by a girl who could not yet drive. But the real harvest was harder to weigh. It was the patience of a child who spent a year watching water while everyone else watched yields. The nerve to knock on doors and ask for what the world had priced at nothing. The discipline to fail once, rebuild every joint, fail again, and go looking for the reason in a table of figures instead of an excuse. And the strange, stubborn faith that what other people throw away still has purpose, if you are willing to sit with it long enough to find out what that purpose is. Della is 12 now. The East Field system is drawn out on butcher paper on the kitchen table, and Wendell Coe comes by on Thursdays to check her arithmetic and mostly finds nothing to fix. Cass surveyed the new line himself with the clear tubing level and has stopped saying anything at all about wasted summers. Wren has a second notebook. The engineering student from Murray State is due in April. Opal has requested new pamphlets from the extension office, the first new ones in years, because, she says, the collection has turned out to be a working library, and a working library needs to stay current. And along the fence rows of Callaway County, if you drive them today, you will notice something missing. The old pipe is gone from the grass. Farm by farm, it has been dragged out, sorted, and measured, because a county full of grown men finally saw what an 11-year-old saw from the seat of a bicycle. Nothing out there was ever really garbage. It was all just waiting for somebody to pay attention. Ladies and gentlemen, right now there are 3 links on your screen. On the left, our newest video. In the center, a square link to our channel. And on the right, a full playlist of stories just like this one. Give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and then enjoy the rest of our videos. Thank you.